Hello, and a very warm welcome to the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast. My name is Simon Brew from Film Stories magazine, and this is a regular podcast celebrating one of the biggest and deepest film libraries in the world. STUDIOCANAL's extensive library of over 6,000 films brings together cinema from around the globe. There are adrenaline rushes such as Rush and Free Fire, international favourites like The Host and The City of Lost Children, and acclaimed modern features including Macbeth with Michael Fassbinder and The Imitation Game. We're going to be doing our best to explore it all on this podcast. This episode, we're bringing into the spotlight the world of German filmmaker Rainer Werner Fassbinder. As we're going to hear, he's a man who made a lot of films in a short amount of time, and we're going to examine one or two of those movies in this episode. I'm going to be joined by film writer and curator Sarah Cleary to help me navigate the world of Fassbinder. To set the scene, here's a little snippet of the sound of his work.
Die Chance, die ich meine, die hat kaum einer. Ich zum Beispiel, ich war 8 Jahre in der Klapsmühle. 8 Jahre, gnädige Frau. 8 lange Jahre als Irrer unter Irren. Und was war? Zurechtgerückt worden bin ich. Dass ich nicht mehr besonders auffalle und kleine Kinder erschrecke. Aber das Einzige, was vielleicht wirklich hätte helfen können, Fehlanzeige.
A very big hello and a welcome then to Sarah Cleary, who's joining me for this episode of the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast. How are you, Sarah?
Not too bad, Simon. I just got done watching a Rainer Werner Fassbinder film, so I'm feeling cheery.
Excellent. I will be setting multiple choice questions on it very, very shortly.
Fabulous.
Before we get there, though, with every guest on this podcast, we just like to get a little film fact off them first. Something like the first film you ever remember seeing. What's the first one that came into your life?
I tell you what, a good early memory I have kind of involving movies is I remember my father was an early adopter of a brand new technology called DVD.
I have heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be big. And he procured for us, the first DVD we ever owned was Star Wars The Phantom Menace, but it arrived before the DVD player did. So I remember just for about a week sitting with this absolutely fascinating object, you know, and all these characters and faces and a lightsaber, you know, and Jar Jar Binks was completely fascinating. And then what was more fascinating was the thing inside, was this the silver disc that somehow contained all of this secret information that I couldn't access because we didn't have the magic box yet. So I think in that week, this kind of image I had of what Star Wars The Phantom Menace was, what a DVD was. I mean, I think maybe that explains my life of cinephilia, as I still want to see that because maybe The Phantom Menace didn't quite live up to it.
Sarah, you haven't lived unless you had to rent a video recorder from Radio Rentals and get your name on the list for Herbie Goes Bananas at your local video store. But, you know, fair dues, we will take that. We'll take that. So we're here to talk about Rainer Werner Fassbinder, and Fassbinder's not someone whose work I was particularly familiar with, and I suspect a few of our listeners are the same. Can you just set him up for us? Can you tell us a little bit about him, a little bit of his background?
So, yeah, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, German filmmaker, part of what kind of came to be known as the German New Wave. Other names that are associated with that would be people like Werner Herzog or Wim Wenders. So it was a loose grouping of filmmakers who were all very interested in very different things, had very different styles, but were all kind of coming up in Germany in the 1960s into the 70s. And Fassbinder came from a background in experimental theatre, and when he started making films, they were very much in a kind of, well, he was sort of modeling himself on things that were happening in France with like the French New Wave. His early films, like Love is Colder Than Death, is very Godard inspired. They're great, but they're kind of hard to get into. And then in the early 1970s, he famously went to go and see a retrospective which I love this, right? Imagine having a life where you could have famously watched some films. It's just fabulous. But yeah, famously, in the early 1970s, he attended a retrospective of films by Douglas Sirk, who was a German director who had fled Nazi Germany to make films in Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s. He made all sorts of films there, musicals, comedies, but he was most famous for making these melodramas, films like Imitation of Life, Magnificent Obsession, All That Heaven Allows, which were kind of looked down upon as they were being made and released as kind of disposable. They were called women's pictures or women's weepies. Sirk himself called them dramas of swollen emotion, which is a phrase I love. So Fassbinder was going to see all these films, and they just completely rewired his brain. He was approaching cinema from this this very radical position of trying to sort of move away from sentimentality, emotionality, accessibility, commercial qualities. But he saw these films and realized that there was an enormous amount of kind of radical potential in the form of melodrama, stories about emotions, about feelings, about romantic relationships, that these kinds of forms he kind of realized could have this enormous potential for a kind of to confront people with things about their own lives, and that rather than running away from emotions, he wanted to kind of plunge headfirst into them. In the kind of mid-70s, he started making different kinds of films that were very much informed by the films of Douglas Sirk. That's stuff like Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, and Fox and His Friends, and The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. So I suppose he sort of learned how to, from Sirk, how to kind of pair because Sirk's films are in their own way very intellectual, and he was coming from a European avant-garde intellectual tradition himself before he came to Hollywood. So he kind of learned how to pair that with a kind of bums on seats showmanship, which made him a very successful and prominent art house filmmaker.
As regular listeners might know, when I'm approaching a filmmaker, I tend to pick one and take a good look at that film, particularly if I'm unfamiliar with the filmmaker. So, Sarah, I chose A Year with 13 Moons. How did I do?
You definitely dived in at the deep end, I think. But at the same time, I think this film does offer a pretty panoramic view of kind of lots of different things that Fassbinder did. It's kind of a bit of a sampling platter, because it definitely has the influence of Sirkian melodrama that I was talking about. It is certainly a drama of swollen emotion, but then there are moments in it where it becomes, I think, chillier. It runs a little colder than some of those other ones that I was speaking about. And then also it has a quality that I really love and admire about his work, where it can kind of slip from these very, very vivid, very real, almost kind of like kitchen sink moments into something that's more expressive, even bordering on surrealistic. And he's very comfortable to kind of move you from one sort of space to another. I suppose, maybe Lynch would be, a comparable filmmaker in that way. There are sequences in this movie that do feel absolutely almost too real, and then it can kind of slip into something that's more expressive.
So Sarah, can you just tell us a little bit about the plot of In a Year of 13 Moons?
So the film follows Elvira, who's a transgender woman who she's not in a good place in her life, to put it mildly.
I think that's a fair way of putting that.
She has a lover, Christoph, who walks out on her, and then we kind of, from that point on, we learn more about her past. We learn that she once had a job in a slaughterhouse, and be forewarned, there is an extensive slaughterhouse, unsimulated slaughterhouse sequence in this film.
Yes, when you say we learn, we learn. That would be a fair way to put it. We learn.
And at some point in the past, when she was working there, this man, Anton, came into her life. And we learned that Anton and her kind of obsession with him, her fixation on him, is what motivated her to go to Casablanca and have, it would have been called a sex change back in the day, gender affirming surgery these days.
Yeah.
And I mean, that leaves us with all sorts of really interesting questions about Elvira that the film doesn't really answer for us. That it kind of leaves us to try and kind of pass all these sort of questions that we might have about her. At one point, a friend of hers remarks that that she went to Casablanca simply because of Anton, that there was no sort of psychological basis, she says, for Elvira transitioning. And I guess that's it. She's a bit of a contentious. This film is contentious in trans circles. She's a bit of a contentious figure in trans filmic representation. There's a kind of, you could even have a debate about, well, if we're to believe that she wasn't suffering from gender dysphoria per se, and she transitioned arbitrarily, is she even a transgender character? And I guess that's a question that Elvira herself is struggling with. But then at the same time, there's something in Volker Spengler's performance that I think lets you know that there is some, kind of, there is this femininity that she expresses, and she does live as a woman. So the film is her kind of, it's not plot heavy. It's a series of vignettes.
Yeah, I looked at my notes afterwards and I'd written down this sentence that it's the only film I've ever seen that has an amusement arcade, an abattoir and some nuns in it.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, just to try and capture the cocktail of what you get here.
Yeah.
And in terms, I mean, you touched on it there, in terms of tonal shifts, I mean, it's quite uncompromising.
Absolutely. He was somebody who, by this point, was absolutely kind of comfortable being himself.
Yeah. So this is what, 1978 the film came out, didn't it?
And yeah, he was completely... He was, I think that's another thing to bear in mind, is that he was famous all around the world, but he was really famous in Germany, almost like a kind of tabloid figure, because he was so kind of outrageous. And even in Year of 13 Moons, there's a sequence in the film where one of the characters is watching television, and he puts himself on that television, speaking about his prodigious work ethic, right, and the amount of films that he's making, which is kind of, I guess, a sort of a not so subtle brag.
The earliest humble brag. Are we going with that?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, no, but maybe not so humble. He chalks it up to a special kind of insanity, I think he says, in the film. So yeah, at this point, he was absolutely kind of comfortable to create something that was, like you say, uncompromising. The film story, it's my understanding, was inspired initially by the recent death of one of his lovers by suicide.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of a reflection on that. And that's something that he'd already kind of brought into his work with these sort of autobiographical elements, but also kind of obfuscating them as well. I mean, The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant is a love triangle between three women that was based on a love triangle of which Fassbinder was one point, that was between three men in real life. So he was, by this point, kind of used to bringing in really difficult aspects of his personal life to kind of form the basis of the stories he was telling.
At the heart of the film is a remarkable central character. I hope I've got the pronunciation right, played by Volker Spengler. And Volker Spengler plays a trans woman, but not, I mean, this is like late 1970s, not in a comedic way, not as a side character, not with flamboyance, a very, very human performance in a way that even modern cinema now is still wrestling about putting such a character across. So, yeah, in such a human way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of humanism that is, I think, an essential part of Fassbinder's films. I think it leavens the kind of the miserableism of them as well, because this film is a really, it's a tough sit, and it really puts that character, Elvira, really puts her through the ringer. But I think as much as this film deals with cruelty, I don't think it is a cruel film.
No, I'd agree with that.
There's a quote of Fassbinder's that I really love, which I think speaks to this. People often criticize my films for being pessimistic. There are certainly many reasons for being pessimistic, but I don't see my films that way. They are founded in the belief that revolution does not belong on the cinema screen, but outside in the world. Never mind if a film ends pessimistically but exposes certain mechanisms clearly enough to show people how they work, the ultimate effect is not pessimistic. So I think that's true of this film, is that it's showing you a character who has a lack of so many things in her life. But in that lack, you know, we, the audience, can see all sorts of things that are wrong with the world, and we can, you know, maybe, you know, take that out into our own lives. You know, he had this conviction that films that tell you something comforting, that wrap everything up with a neat bow, that those
Yeah.
that leaves an audience in too comfortable a position, that audiences themselves need to be left with something to do.
Was it consistent throughout his career and his body of work then that he saw the relationship between his stories and the audience not ending with the end credits? Because that quote that you just read us there suggests someone who's putting stories into the world that have a tail to them long after we've left the cinema or finished watching the movie.
100%. I mean, I haven't seen all of Fassbinder's films because I don't have quite enough.
There are a lot of them, Sarah.
There are a fair few to get through, but certainly all the ones that I have seen, they always end on this ambivalent, unresolved note that leaves you with, like, if not even necessarily questions about, oh, what will the characters go on and do after the credits have rolled, but more a sense that, how will I apply what I've seen to my own life? You know, what have I seen reflected back at me, and what will I do with that, with that insight? And yeah, I mean, like, reflections, mirrors, this is another thing that he takes from Cirque, this melodramatic motif of the mirror, of self-reflection. I think he fills his films with mirrors, with literal mirrors, literal reflective surfaces. Right. So, you know, his characters are constantly trying to examine themselves, try to understand themselves, and the mirror is kind of a metaphor for that. But then the films themselves have this amazing quality to kind of reflect the viewer back at themselves.
There's also a clear foundation in cinema as well, isn't there? Just in the skill of cinema, because I was quite arrested by the soundscape of the film. I mean, it goes quite harsh at certain points, the sound of it. But then also, as I understand it, Fassbinder had feet in theatre as well, and the blocking of the actors and the positioning of certain characters at certain points. I mean, there's a particularly haunting scene towards the end that I don't want to spoil, and I'm just looking at where he's got his characters standing and sitting in one particular scene. I was just, even that is some degree of, I mean, it's stark, really, skillful and stark.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of blocking and staging, Rainer Werner Fassbinder is like one of the very best. The interplay between actors and the camera, and I think it's like him, Paul Verhoeven, and Steven Spielberg for me. They're like the three untouchable greatest for just putting human beings in a room and moving a camera through them in a kind of dance with them. But Rainer Werner Fassbinder might well be my favorite. I mean, I think, yeah, that's another thing that's a bit mind-boggling about him, is that it's not just that he created so much, that he created so much to such a high standard. And I think that's another thing that helps leaven the heaviness of a story like this, is that there's a lot of beauty in the way that he tells the story. And yeah, absolutely, like you say, the things that he's doing with sound and with music. I mean, I think at a time when needle drops, as we understand them now, were a relatively new thing. You know, they were coming from underground avant-garde cinema, stuff like Kenneth Anger and Scorpio Rising, you know, which then begets what Martin Scorsese was doing in like Mean Streets. You know, obviously Martin Scorsese, you know, the king of the needle drop, probably. But I think, you know, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, what he was doing with his films, much more than some of his contemporaries, I think he saw this amazing potential in like using pop music in all sorts of interesting ways. Like in this film, there's a scene, where Elvira is crying in a kind of an amusement arcade with all of these, you know, sort of kind of intense young men crowding around these 70s, you know, arcade machines and playing these different war games, and she's just crying, and he put some Roxy Music in there, a song called A Song for Europe by Roxy Music, who were one of his favorite bands. This is not something that would ever have occurred to Werner Herzog to do. That idea of underscoring such a profound moment of sadness with the voice of Brian Ferry. I mean, he was next level. He really was.
Here as I sit at this empty cafe, thinking of you.
It was not a film I was expecting to see vintage video games in. I mean, this is supposed to be an area of expertise for me, and I couldn't place any of them.
Got you. Yeah. Well, maybe they were all German originals. They're fabulous though, and I love that sequence. I mean, you want to talk about Thousands of Mirrors, you know, the way that he uses all the reflective surfaces, you know, the screens and then these reflective walls in this video arcade. It's really creating this incredible like hall of mirrors effect. And it's established early on in the film that Elvira is kind of afraid of her own reflection. She's sort of afraid of looking at herself, truly taking stock of her life and her experiences, but then also just to look at her face, you know, because she's afraid of what she might see. So the way that in a sequence like that, Fassbinder is just completely like crowding her with all these reflective surfaces that she's having to just sort of try and tune out. It's a really, really fantastic sequence. And you have to think he's getting this amazing effect, this incredible cinematic effect out of just plonking a camera down in a video arcade and just finding the angles and letting that space become so expressive, as if I think it's kind of it's almost like he used real found spaces as though they were multi-million-dollar Hollywood sets.
Yeah, I should point out as well, I mean, there's a battle sometimes over people having a film by credit on the front of a movie that Fassbinder directed, wrote, produced, shot and co-edited the movie as well. I mean, and then move straight on to something else.
Yeah, it's enough to make you feel a little bit lazy.
Well, quite. I mean, I'm putting my feet up with a coffee now, exhausted at the mere thought of it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
I got a lot out of A Year with 13 Moons. I found it a provocative and sometimes very difficult film to watch, and some of the visuals of it incredibly arresting and not always comfortable at all. But, I mean, talking to you a day or two ago, you also mentioned a film, Lola, of which you're a fan.
Yeah, so that's one of the ones I revisited for this podcast. Lola is a really incredible bit of work. It's got a lot in common with In A Year of 13 Moons thematically.
Yeah.
They're kind of both about women trying to navigate the world of men, and a recurrent theme in such a huge amount of Fassbinder's work is the kind of transactional nature of so much love and sex and marriage, and you know, this is really cheery stuff. But no, Lola is wonderful, and it comes from this kind of late phase of his career as he's kind of moving into the 80s, although he didn't get the chance to make very much during the 1980s.
So this is what, 1981, Lola?
Yeah. And he's, I think, getting more of the resources that he kind of maybe always dreamed of having, and his films, they start to look a lot more like the lush Hollywood films that were inspiring him. So there are moments in Lola where it's set in the 1950s. It's all to do with, kind of building back Germany after the war and kind of corruption in city planning and building.
Yeah.
It's set in the 1950s, and there are moments in it where you would swear that it was a film that was made in the 1950s, because he's by that point so much kind of absorbed the kind of the technique and the language and the use of color. And I think also he's finally kind of got the resources to start, building big sets and doing period settings. And I like that a lot as well. But I think there's something about the films of the 1970s where there's this sort of tension between his vaulting ambition and boundless energy and slightly slimmer resources. But at the same time, it's, given the kinds of careers that, Wim Wenders went to America and made Paris, Texas. Obviously, Werner Herzog has had this, amazing, career where he's ended up being, this impossible thing, a true, worldwide household name of a art house German director.
A villain in a Tom Cruise movie, Werner Herzog, right?
Right, exactly. This is, so it really does, a film like Lola or Querelle, Veronica Voss, these kind of lusher movies that he was making towards the end of his life and career, it really does kind of set your mind racing about what he could have achieved if he'd kind of got on his hands on, like, Hollywood money.
I do think he achieved quite a lot, though. I mean, I'll give him credit there. We're back to 45 films, a whole bunch of output, and just a relentless pace of storytelling, which to a degree sounded like it just caught up with him towards the end. He did die young, and at the point he died, he was still planning even more films.
No, absolutely. I mean, that incredible productivity and his self-destructiveness, they kind of were hand in hand. I mean, and as is the case with In a Year of 13 Moons, he was drawing on the mess of his own life. He was trying to, he was referring to genre and to other filmmakers, but his kind of greatest source of inspiration was the mess of his life. So I think maybe, there was this cyclical thing of you make the mess to make the movies, to make more mess, to make more movies. And that kind of a cycle, I suppose it was untenable.
Yeah, unsustainable, certainly, as well. I mean, clearly. Both Lola and In a Year of 13 Moons are available on DVD and Blu-ray on the Vintage World Classics label. So then, Sarah, before we let you go, we ask every guest on this podcast to give us a double bill from the STUDIOCANAL archives. So I'm waiting with bated breath. Tell me, what have you picked?
Well, I figured we could maybe afford to sort of to lighten the mood a little bit, and going through the back catalogue, two films that were very important to me growing up leapt out at me, and so I'm going to be totally self-indulgent here and say Doctor Who and the Daleks from 1965, followed, funnily enough, by Daleks Invasion Earth 2150 AD from 1966.
A million bonus points straight away to you there, Sarah Cleary. Tell us why these films are, why you've picked them, why they're so special to you.
Well, growing up, I was a huge Doctor Who fan, and these films, they were a part of my kind of classical Doctor Who education, I suppose. So, when I was growing up, my Doctors on television, being broadcast as I was growing up, they were Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant, but I had all this kind of curiosity about, I was getting into, as a child, into older films. I was kind of beginning my 20th century fixation, which, I still have.
You youngsters, honestly, a 20th, you're making me feel so old. A 20th century fixation.
My apologies, Simon. But classic Doctor Who became a big part of that. So I got really interested in the older serials. And these films, they were they were fascinating, right? Because they were Doctor Who, but they weren't Doctor Who, or they weren't quite right. As anyone who's interested in Doctor Who will know, these films, they're not canonical, and they were adaptations of two of the serials that had been done on television with William Hartnell, but with some of the details wrong. So, as every Whovian knows, these are the ones where they call him Doctor Who rather than the Doctor, and there are all sorts of strange little discrepancies. So as a child, that was really fascinating to me. But then more than anything, I loved the older Doctor Who serials when I was small, but I found the 60s ones with Hartnell, I loved the way they looked, I loved the way they felt, but they were so leisurely paced. And now I watch depressing German art films for my own pleasure these days, and I still find them a little bit leisurely paced. So these sort of, like, they wouldn't have been Technicolor, but they're in beautiful kind of 1960s color with these amazing, kind of Austin Powers sets, and they moved at a clip, and they were all killer, no filler, all Dalek action all the time. So I just loved them to bits. And in my own curatorial work, putting together film screenings, I tend to go for stuff that's to do with, queer film history. That means a lot of heavier films. That means Rainer Werner Fassbinder films. So I guess when you ask me what's a dream double bill, I kind of just want to kick back and relax with the Daleks.
There are 3 ways in this conversation you've made me feel particularly old, Sarah Cleary. Let me list them for you now. You've talked about your 20th century fixation, about your first film experience being a DVD. And then you describe Doctor Who as classic Doctor Who, when us vintage Doctor Who fans know it's just called Doctor Who. Sarah Cleary, thank you so much for joining us on the Studio Canal Presents podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Doctor Who and the Daleks and Daleks Invasion Earth 2150 AD are available on Studio Canal Presents on Apple TV and Prime Video. Just time for a bit of quick news from the world of Studio Canal. And let's do the big screen first. Heading to UK cinemas is Mike Flanagan's The Life of Chuck. It's based on a story from Stephen King, and the movie stars Tom Hiddleston, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Mark Hamill and Karen Gillan, and it hits UK cinema screens on August the 22nd. Here's a taste of the trailer.
The universe is large, and it contains multitudes, but it also contains me.
As mentioned last time, there's a new film coming from director Michael Hazanavicius. Hazanavicius previously directed the Oscar-winning The Artist, and his latest is a World War II set animated drama, The Most Precious of Cargoes. It's coming to UK cinema screens on the 4th of April 2025. Finally, Mike Leigh's acclaimed, brilliant Hard Truths is now available to watch via premium video on demand at home, and it's also coming to DVD and Blu-ray on the 21st of April. I'll be back soon with the next episode of Studio Canal Presents. Until the next time, to get all the news on Studio Canal films as it happens, and to find out more about the Apple TV and Prime Video channels, you can visit www.studiocanal.co.uk or follow Studio Canal at Studio Canal UK on X, Instagram and TikTok. For now, I'm just going to go off and seek some more films with nuns in them. Ta-ta for now.